What were the consequences of America's biggest socialist public works project? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy here on the internet. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're brand new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principled articles and videos and presentations on the libertarian philosophy. Okay, Richard, we've known each other for many, many years. You sometimes tell people that when we first met, I was testing you to see where you stood on various issues of the day. And we're going to talk about an issue today that I've always had doubts about you with respect to this particular issue. And we're going to talk about the Interstate Highway System. You see, because you're always telling me, oh, that you go and visit your stepdaughter and their family in New York or in Florida or what have you. And I know you're using the Interstate Highway System when you're going to visit these people. And so I can only assume that you're one of the great proponents of this massive socialist program, which is very disappointing to me because, I would think that given all the work you've done in Austrian economics and opposing socialism and quoting Mises, that here is your favorite socialist project. Now, am I wrong or what, Richard?
Okay, viewers and listeners, if you only knew what I've had to put up with for all these years. Now, if you really want to zing him, send him a text message or an email and say, when you visit your relatives at holiday time in Texas, Mr. Hornberger, how do you get there? What roads do you use? Oh, Mr. Hornberger, I heard you recently went on a week holiday and was staying somewhere away from your home. How did you get there, Mr. Hornberger? Please be sure to do that. Now, but seriously, if you can be serious with this guy, seriously, it's taken for granted that government has to do a variety of things. And it's usually presumed that roads are one of them. Infrastructure, the Biden administration, and before that, the Trump and the Obama, and all the way going back to the Eisenhower, who basically initiated what we now call the Interstate Highway System, was the presumption that government has to provide the roads and thoroughfares. But I was pointing out to Jacob that there was an economist named Francis A. Walker, who was born in 1840 and he died in 1897. He was very famous. He taught for many years at Johns Hopkins University, one of the leading American economists of the late 19th century. And he wrote a textbook on economics, then called political economy, in 1883. And towards the end of the book, he has a chapter on government policies. And one of the things he touches upon are roads. And he says that historically, it has been many, many cases that roads were private enterprise projects. The roads would be built where people needed them, bridges or ferries would be supplied and provided by the private sector. And those who used the roads would pay tolls. If you used it little, you paid little. If you used it a lot, you paid more. And if you wished to use none of the roads, you paid nothing. But that now there was emerging this presumption increasingly that roads and highways had to be provided by the government, in which everyone was compelled to pay some form of a tax or mandatory fee, regardless of whether one needed those roads, frequented them or not. And that he, in fact, called this road socialism, was a phrase he uses in the book. And that sounds so bizarre and strange to people today. But it's only an example of the presumption that if government has provided something for a very long time, for several generations, to then challenge it leads people to the assumption that the private market couldn't do this. But in fact, both certainly in the past and in some places even still today, including in the United States, there are private roads and there are tolls that are paid. for the services of using them, separate from the government versions of these things. The advantage of private roads is that it is ultimately the people through market incentives that determine where the roads and highways and thoroughfares will be. It's an investment. You have to make an entrepreneurial, profit, risk-taking a judgment as to where you think towns, cities, manufacturing areas will be growing and expanding, where the roads will be needed by people where they choose to live, work, and shop, rather than the current system where these are planned and laid out by the government. This is where we're going to have these roads. These are the patterns and the structures and the forms and the expenses that will be incurred. Invariably at taxpayers' expense, often, of course, through gasoline taxes, both at the federal and the state level, but other types of taxes as well. So the question, as with all things, Jacob, is that who knows better where a service should be provided? And roads are a service, certainly. Should the market determine this based upon where private providers think people want to go and with what convenience and frequency in terms of the size of the road that might be needed? Or shall the government decide what they think we need and where we should be going and how, with what thoroughfares, and impose that system upon the whole country, and then make us pay for it without our consent through the taxing system? So again, it's basically the market versus socialism. And so when Francis Walker said in 1883 that this was a form of road socialism, he was not very far from the truth.
No, absolutely. And okay, we're talking about two different things, but they're not really two different things. But I think we ought to at least distinguish them. That we're talking about regular roads, and then we're talking about the interstate highway system. And let me focus just on the interstate highway system. The points you make about roads, of course, apply to the interstate highway system, but this thing is such a monstrosity that I think it deserves some special focus. This is, I think, the largest socialist project in American history, at least on a domestic level here. I can't think of anyone larger. And it clearly is not countenanced in the Constitution. I don't see any constitutional grant to build the highways. And in fact, it had been inspired by Hitler's Autobahn society, Autobahn system. That Eisenhower was over there during World War II, and he saw Autobahn, that he had seen Hitler's Autobahn system, and he was very impressed by it. So he comes back, he's elected president, and he says, I want to establish the same kind of system over here. And there was no constitutional authority for it. He knew it. So he used the so-called defense argument that I can do this under defending America. Military defense against an invasion. And his argument was that if we're invaded, this would enable our troops and our tanks and our vehicles to get across the country quicker. And of course, that was ridiculous because it would actually enable the enemy invaders to get across the country quicker. You're better off obstructing them with forests and trees and so forth. But it was just a sham. And they ended up, Richard, wreaking untold devastation. You know, it's a classic example of Bastiat's and Henry Hazlitt's concept of what is seen and not seen, that they focus on the highway system and say, look how wonderful it is. Oh, these people can go from, you know, Virginia to California so easily now and so forth. But what they don't focus on is on all the capital that was seized from American taxpayers to pay for this monstrosity, but also all the people they destroyed in doing this. You know, in the roads that cross the country, motels had developed, restaurants, tourist traps, all sorts of things, like in Route 66. Immediately, at the moment the interstate highway system in those areas opened up, those businesses went into bankruptcy. They were all just sent out of business because everything started developing around the interstate highway system and the exits off the interstate highway system. All the people in those towns were just put out of business. It was as if they didn't count. And then they destroyed whole neighborhoods. Remember that the way they did this and the way they built the roads, as you were talking about, was through eminent domain, seizing property from people against their will. Now they paid them, quote, just compensation, but a lot of times it wasn't anything at all. And this was especially true with respect to poor people. They devastated poor neighborhoods because the rich had the clout to make sure that interstate highway system was routed around their neighborhoods, but the poor didn't have that clout. And so they destroyed entire neighborhoods, and they give people a pittance, just compensation, the fair market value of their home. But where were they going to go? They couldn't buy anything with that money. And the neighborhoods had been there for years, decades, very, nice, cohesive neighborhoods, and just devastated with this thing. So this was just your massive government project. They also drove out of business the train system. I mean, when you give a free subsidy to the automobile industry, and that's what it is, I mean, the automobile industry would have had to build the roads in order to sell cars. But no, they give this free subsidy and then wonder why the train business goes out of business, and they end up with this massive socialist project called Amtrak, government owned and government operated. So you have all these unseen adverse consequences of this socialist program that I think people give short shrift to, Richard.
Well, I think, your point about that, often the building of the interstate system undermined the more localized and traditional road and highways. I would ask the viewers and listeners to remember that this is brought out in one of Alfred Hitchcock's movies, Psycho. Janet Leigh has stolen some money from her employer in Los Angeles, and she's driving to get to her boyfriend in the center part of California, and she gets on one of the side roads, and it's the Bates Motel, and she comes to stop, and what was it? Anthony, who was the actor? I'm forgetting who played
Anthony Perkins.
Anthony Perkins, thank you. So he's Bates, right? The psycho guy. And he says, "Oh, we have all of our cabins available. Since they built the interstate, we've lost all of our business." So it was in an Alfred Hitchcock movie, which enabled him to do his weird stuff, obviously. But anyway, but you're absolutely right. It basically was the government deciding not merely where the road should be, and not merely deciding whose property would be left standing and whose would be negatively affected, and so on, or taken for part of the road system. But this also is a central planning method of influencing where and what towns and cities develop. Obviously, if the government has built an interstate highway system, that lowers the costs and provides greater conveniences to get from one place to another. And therefore now this government road system influences the entire evolution and development of urban municipal areas of the United States. So it spills over to an additional element of the planning mechanism of government, where it's not just the highways, but the highway locations influencing where towns and cities and small communities or larger communities will in fact evolve or even emerge. So it's basically those immense amount of unintended consequences of influencing the entire economic development and infrastructure development of the United States. So where should towns and cities be? Where should the roads be to get across the country? How many roads should there be? We don't know that because the government has preempted all of those choices that would have been made in the market, guided by the profit opportunities provided by the price signals of competitive markets.
Right, and look what ended up happening. You got this massive number of cars on the highways.
Yes.
Because it's so easy. And then they lament that there's all this air pollution from all the cars that are on the highway. So then they have to start mandating catalytic converters and all these other regulatory methods, when it was all rooted in their original socialist project. Because I think it's safe to say that if the government had not been building the roads, and they had been built naturally just through the market process, where a company says, hey, I can make a profit on this thing, and they go to landowners, they buy up the land there voluntarily, no force of eminent domain. I think it's safe to say that would have resulted in a lot fewer automobiles on the road. And then the transportation system would have developed in an entirely different way. We probably would have had a very sophisticated passenger train system. Planes would have probably been a lot cheaper, with a lot more customers patronizing the planes. So they really just distorted the entire transportation system in America. And there's some real horror stories about them taking land away from people to do this thing. In the Blue Ridge Parkway over here in Virginia, they say, oh, they call it a little sliver of silver going through the beautiful mountains, about how you can travel through. But there's horror stories about how they took away people's land that had been there for generations.
Yes.
These were poor people. This had been in their family for like I say, generations. They didn't have the wherewithal to fight the government. Well, and then how can you fight the government? Eminent domain, there is no defense. The only argument in an eminent domain taking is how much they're going to pay you. But there are heroic stories of where people really were resisting this tyranny there in the Blue Ridge area of Virginia, but they ended up losing. They ended up being evicted from their homes to build a little beautiful silver slither of highway through the mountains there. And all they're really doing, Richard, is defacing the environment. I mean, that's what's so funny is how they say, oh, it's just this beautiful highway in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They've defaced the Blue Ridge Mountains, but they don't see it that way when they're the ones doing the defacing.
And I think also the point is that if the federal government is going to undertake this vast spending on an interstate highway system, either direct federal expenses or subsidies for the state governments, because the state governments are actually, quote, responsible for their segments of the interstate highway system. How do these highways get built? It requires government contracts, either federal contracts or federal subsidized state contracts. So you have this vast network of a special interest group, construction companies. And anyone who has ridden on the interstate system, and particularly in the year before an election is coming up, finds it irritating and frustrating and anger creating. Why? Because of the constant road repairs. I live in a subdivision that's only a few years old here in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And obviously, since the company that built the homes needed an access road and then the road right in front of the houses itself, they had to pay a construction company to do the road. And I can assure you that road was there like that. Good quality, smooth, no problem. You go down one of these interstates and the same 1 or 2 miles of road repair or construction, it's there for months, years. And why? Because they're stretching out the government payola of the contract that is being done at the taxpayer's expense. Let me make a few other comparisons. People, particularly since COVID, have gotten so used to shopping online, ordering and having it delivered. But it is not that long ago that shopping, as well as a social outing, was done at shopping malls, particularly the indoor shopping malls. And how did you get to an indoor shopping mall? There was an access road from some other thoroughfare, and there was there are these huge parking lots, and they're provided for free, but they're not built for free. The shopping mall company or corporation pays for this. The access road, the huge parking lot, provides the facilities and amenities inside the shopping mall that you can just use and take advantage of. Why? Because they want to be able to have rental incomes from the units in the shopping mall. And if the customers cannot get into the area, and if they can't have a convenient place to park, they can't go into the mall to do the shopping, which provides the retail outlets with the income that enables them to pay the rents to the mall company. So the thing is, all of this is provided by the market. This idea, oh, if the government didn't do it, we wouldn't have roads, we wouldn't have parking facilities, we wouldn't have this, we have that. This is just absolute nonsense. It's done better, it's done less expensively, and it's done far more efficiently in both in terms of quality and time to do it when it's left up to the private sector. Because when it's the private sector, the purchaser, the investor is spending their own money and they want to minimize the expense, but have the quality that they consider necessary to satisfy their consumers, so as to then, having made that investment, be able to bring forth the business that generates the revenues out of which their costs for doing this and the hoped for profits can come. But when the government does any of this, it's with other people's money. You can't refuse your money to be spent this way. You can't say, I don't need a road here, I don't need an access facility here. No, your money is going to be taken through one form of tax or another, and it'll be the highway central planners who determine what you get, where it goes, and what it's going to cost. And that just serves the special interests of the bureaucrats, the politicians, and those who are living off those monies at the government trough.
Yeah, that's a great point about the malls and the parking areas and so forth, because it's all privately done, and you don't see the potholes in those areas. And it's my understanding, I could be mistaken, that in Disney World, that it's all privately owned, and that Disney provides its own streets and maintains them. And it's been many, many years since I've been to Disney, but I am willing to bet that those streets inside that area are perfectly maintained, because it's in Disney's interest to do so. I mean, and so it gives you kind of an example of what you're talking about, that if everything was privately owned, private owners take care of things. And it's in their incentive to take care of things for business reasons. They're not being benevolent. They say, this is the way we increase our business. If you got bad roads, less people are going to come and patronize Disney World. The other thing that I think I'd like to focus on, Richard, before we wrap it up, is the importance of capital. You know, we talk about this in Austrian economics, that the way to increase people's standard of living is through savings. Savings go into capital. Capital gets the tools and equipment that makes workers more productive. And so this is one of the ways you increase standards of living and wage rates, real wage rates, by increasing the level of savings in a society. And so to the extent that government seizes capital to fund these giant socialist programs like the Interstate Highway System, or just roads in general, as you pointed out at the beginning, to that extent, this is what people don't realize, they're lowering your standard of living at the same time. It's one of those unseen consequences that you don't see the businesses coming into existence that would have come into existence had people been free to keep their own money. So all you see is this giant public work socialist project that they point to. But let's say it costs $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion that's taken out of the pockets of the American people that would have gone into productive capital that would have increased their standard of living.
Absolutely. Once again, it just shows that the market is better than anything the government hand is turned to. And the reason is the market means just all of us making personal, voluntary, mutually beneficial decisions and agreements through what we think will improve our circumstances in these reciprocal, self-interested ways. But the government is not the people. It is individuals who have their own agendas, their own purposes, and have one tool that people in the private sector do not have. And that is the power of legalized and legitimized coercion. Now, if you believe in limited government, you may feel that the government has to have the authority for police and properly understood national defense and the court system, obviously. But when government does anything beyond those reasonable but limited functions for the peace and possible prosperity of a society through savings and investment, as you were pointing out, and the security of your property in that way, when government goes beyond that, it is now preempting and co-opting the choices that you and I could make as private individuals, and take the resources that we have honestly made and using it for purposes and forms that they've decided, which may have nothing to do with what we want, but often lines the pocket of those that keep them in power.
Okay, on that excellent note, we'll wrap things up. I should add, though, that you mentioned the periodic trips that I take to Texas. And I'm planning another one soon. And so I got to go ahead and wrap this thing up I got some maintenance to do on my helicopter that I use.
Yeah, right. Right.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thanks for tuning in. Come and visit us at fff.org for 34 years of principal arguments on liberty. Richard, look forward to talking to you. Greatly enjoyed the conversation as always.